Thank you for joining Market News with Rodney Lake. This is a regular program for the GW Investment Institute, where we talk about timely market topics. I'm Rodney Lake, the director of the GW Investment Institute. Let's get started. Welcome back to Market News with Rodney Lake. I'm your host, Rodney Lake. Today's episode, we're going to go over what we really do in class for Market News. We're going to go over a variety of different things. Now, we're going to talk about some individual companies, most certainly, but today we're going to check in with the market. There's been a lot going on, so I think it's worth taking some time to figure out what's happening. What do we think? Now, the Trump administration 47, if you'd like to say Trump 47 or Trump 2.0, how would you like to do it? Tariffs are at the top of the list. Everybody sometimes go from freaking out to everything's fine and everything in between. And the market then reflects that uncertainty and sentiment. And so on the days like yesterday, today is March 25th when we're recording this, a day like yesterday, the market sailed ahead and the market's doing just fine again today because Trump said, well, maybe we're going to get a little bit of relief in here for this. Well, for the Investment Institute and for our portfolios, we're long-term investors. So we're trying to think, long-term, but we're certainly trying to pay attention to what's happening in the short term and really trying to understand what are the impacts on the companies that we own for these tariffs. So many of the companies we have are very global companies. At the top of the list of concerns for what's happening in the world is what's the relationship between China and the U.S. Right now, what's happening in China is the Global Development Forum. There are companies in China right now. It's in Beijing. It's hosted and trying to develop this relationships between the government in China and global companies. So some of the notable U.S. companies in attendance, including Apple, Tim Cook, Pfizer, Broadcom, Micron, MasterCard. So these are companies that are there, trying to sort of build these relationships and keep these relationships that already exist. Obviously, let's dial in for Apple in a moment. We'll talk about that. But China is, again, at the top of the list for the tariffs talk for the Trump administration right now. So I think it's worth some time to try to figure that out. I also just spent some time in China, and I'm going to have a special episode on that to talk about a little bit of reflection on the trip, but also a little bit of a dive in to what the Chinese market is looking right now, as a, equity market overall. But that'll be at a separate episode to be continued and to, come out later. But that's an important conference. These are important companies that are over there. Now, let's dive in a little bit on what's happening with Apple in China. So the market news there is that the Chinese market's obviously a very important market for manufacturing, using Foxconn as an example, but also for sales in China. It used to represent, let's say, 20%, and now it's down below 15%. So that's a pretty rapid change. One of the reasons is local competition has been picking up, and sort of this icing between the U.S. and Chinese relations. And so, but a company like Huawei, for example, is gaining ground for sales against Apple in that Chinese market. And so it's really important market for Apple, so they need to continue to stay focused on that. And there's obviously some things within Apple, which we'll talk about, that has possibly, they've stepped on their own toes in this case, where, the 16 is maybe not as fully featured with the AI as they would like at the moment, but they'll have time possibly to catch up. But again, other companies are in China, and I think it's worth noting to say that the Chinese market is having some trouble. They're trying to get their market going from an export-driven market to a consumer-driven market. That takes time, but certainly the number one GDP in the world, the number two GDP in the world, the U.S. and China, these are super important markets. I think they're going to be joined at the hip for a long time. And it's certainly better for us to think about, each other's strengths and, to serve our strengths together to try to figure out how do we do business together? How do we work together? I think these are going to be the most notable markets, moving forward. Now, other markets like India are very important, for example, for Apple as well, as an example, but certainly not as important in the next immediate term and the next, let's say, medium term for Apple and for other companies too. It's just a much bigger market by GDP. So what else can we say about what's happening specifically with Apple? Well, if we dive in, I mentioned this already, what's happening with the AI? Well, you could call them a laggard at this point. Apple is one of the largest holdings for the GW Investment Institute. Remember, educational purposes only here. So it's something that we think about, something that we talk about. Obviously, almost everyone knows about Apple. A lot of people have iPhones, the installed base, over 1 billion iPhones installed and more than, 2 billion devices. So this is an important company. This is an important, market, and certainly an important company as for owners for us to think about. Now, they have been late to the game, and some people would say, well, that's the typical Apple setup where, okay, they're going to be a little bit later, but they're going to get it right. They're going to figure out what's the best way to play AI on their platform, and they're going to, take advantage of what's already happened out there. They don't have to pick the winner, although it seems like, that the early partnership with ChatGPT and OpenAI looks like they have selected that. Now, in some regards, OpenAI and specifically ChatGPT and now ChatGPT 4.5 does look like the leader in the large language models. Now, there is competition. Claude Sonnet is certainly doing well. Grok 3 is doing well. Gemini, I would say, is in the back seat at the moment on a lot of the things. And now they do lead in some categories, like the context windows as an example. So it's also hard to determine, how, when you're saying what's the best, how do you figure that out? Well, there are different ways to understand that. And then, of course, DeepSeek, we mentioned China, coming out of China, which is a very important open source model on reasoning and has done very well. And, now how they got there, maybe it's not quite as cheap as they have said for the production of that model, but it's certainly worth noting that it is a very efficient reasoning model. And I think it's going to be a key player at least in the short term here, moving forward in the medium term. Now, the landscape is changing so rapidly, it's really hard to determine what does the next 3 years look like. Now, these companies are all spending a lot of money on these things, and maybe Apple can then figure out a way, pulling it back to Apple here, maybe Apple can figure out a way to use all the models or give choice for people for the models that they want to use on their devices, whether that be their phone or their iPad or their MacBooks or their Mac Airs, whatever they happen to be using. And maybe that's going to be the best in class, that you get access to any of the models that you want. You have access to all the models, and Apple's the best way on the device through their OS and their hardware, software world to access those models and for you to be productive using those models. Time will tell. Apple has done it before where they've been late to the game. They certainly were not the first, smartphone, but they were, they ended up being the leader in that case. So we'll have to see. As investors, we're paying attention. Now, the market cap for Apple, $3.3 trillion as we sit today. The forward PE, it's certainly not cheap. 30 times, that's not cheap. And I really think, they're going to have to figure this out. The services business continues to be a powerhouse for Apple and, possibly why they deserve this larger margin. And I think that's important to note. But again, super important company, super important in our portfolio, very much in the news. Global Development Forum happening in China. At the top of that list of attendees is Tim Cook and Apple. And I think people should be paying attention to the relationships between the U.S. and China through companies like Apple. And as I mentioned, was in China for a week recently. For GW, visiting different universities. And I'm going to have an episode talking about that and the things that I saw from my perspective and the things that I think are important, the things that are happening now. But we'll spend a whole episode on that. Now, I do think it's timely and important to mention the Global Development Forum. And again, a company like Apple headlining that and Tim Cook spending his time over there and meeting with Xi Jinping and other government officials. I think that's notable, and that you should be, as an analyst, as a business person, as an investor, paying attention to what's happening there. And we'll talk about some of the Chinese companies here to come as well. The partnership that they're building with Apple in China is with Alibaba, so I think that's also worth spending time on, and we'll spend some time on talking about Alibaba as well. That said, some of the other companies that I do think it's important for us to be paying attention to. Now, it's hard to really talk about what's happening in the market without talking about Nvidia because they're so consequential. Now, you had this big run up and now pullback in the market. And Nvidia has been, at the center of that. The year-to-date number here in March 25th, when we're recording this, is down almost 11% year-to-date, and it's down today. Meanwhile, some other companies are up on the day. Apple, Microsoft up as an example. And again, we're not day traders, but just to give you some context, But if you look at sort of the overall numbers, the year-to-date number for Apple is down 11, so very similar to what Nvidia is experiencing. So we always talk about Nvidia, it seems like, but I do think when we're going over market news, you got to talk about what's happening there. It doesn't seem like any of the big hyperscalers are spending any less money. It doesn't look like anybody wants to fall behind. We've talked about that in the past, and certainly Nvidia is the company that's selling all these chips. Now you do now that we tie in China, you do have concerns about can they produce the most advanced chips outside of Taiwan? The factories here in the U.S. being built, for example, in Arizona by Taiwan Semiconductor, they don't seem to be going as rapidly on the build as everybody would like, certainly the people that are in charge of that. And are they going to be able to produce the most advanced chips right away? They are not. So they're not going to produce the most advanced. The most advanced will continue to be built in Taiwan by TSMC. And the TSMC factories in Arizona, for example, will produce less advanced chips, advanced, compared to what you and I could produce, in our lab that we would set up overnight, but certainly not the most advanced in the world, even relative to the things that they do. So it is important to think about that. See, now that can come, and it may come more rapidly than we expect. Once they get up and running, once they get production going, maybe it's more feasible for them to get the most advanced chips more rapidly than we expect after that point. Now, time will tell, but they are having some trouble there. But I do think it's worth thinking about NVIDIA and its position, and it's really its moat. So when we talk about the business, the management, the price valuation, and the balance sheet for these companies, we talk about NVIDIA. And when we talk about the business and we talk about the management in particular, Jensen Huang, and we had Dan Ives on. He talks about Jensen Huang as the godfather of AI. His management style is very particular, 40 direct reports approximately, very different, structure than many other companies, founder-led companies. So we still think that's good. The moat around the business is that there is no second place at the moment that's close, right? A distant second place might be AMD, and that is a distant second place at the moment. If you look at the spend in the server market in the last earnings for AMD, they really didn't have it. And so, there hasn't been any really news since then when we're paying attention again here to market news of why anyone else is really catching up. And meanwhile, NVIDIA is not sitting still. Blackwell is coming out. The next generation of chips are coming out. And they are saying that, DeepSeek, for example, was a big, eye-opener, and people thought it's going to put a big dent in their market. Well, they're saying something different. Jensen Huang is saying, look, this is all good because what's going to happen is this is going to fan out, and there's going to be a lot more opportunity for us to serve different customers. And this is one example of how that could play out moving forward. But NVIDIA, with their hardware and software, now we go back to the business management, price valuation, and balance sheet, and dive in on business. The business is hardware and software, different than AMD, for example. Not that they don't have anything, but they certainly do not have the capabilities that NVIDIA has built over the last, let's say, 20 years. And we've mentioned this before, more like an ecosystem like Apple, where you get in there and you have CUDA, which is the software layer for NVIDIA, and that's what helps you define the operations that you want and make your setup more efficient. And once you get all that built, do you really want to change, right? If you really define things on the hardware and the software side, and it's running for the things that you want to do. So there's some level of customization that you can do on the software side that makes your applications, makes the things that you want to do with that AI much more efficient. Well, then, switching to someone else is a big lift. There is a barrier to exit there. That is important when you talk about what's the moat for that business. Who's in second place? Seems distant, right? Now that not that there's not anybody else, but you can think about names like Broadcom and AMD and others, and Qualcomm even in this case. So it's important, and I should mention before I forget, Qualcomm also on the list of global development forums in China. So important to think about there, and a company that we own in the portfolio. So again, these are important things. This is something that you should be thinking about. And now let's just talk about another company that's certainly in the news, Microsoft. Also down year to date, not as much, about just over 6% year to date. Now and if we look at the business of Microsoft, they continue to be dominant. Azure, leading investor in ChatGPT, so they certainly sit at the pole position right now on what's happening with AI. And again, they're customers are, ready to adopt things like Copilot. And you have to think, well, maybe that Microsoft is going to be, and Dan Ives mentioned this when he was here, talking about maybe Microsoft is a secondary AI play on the software side, because the applications that flow through their businesses are going to be aided by software. So they have this installed base, that they're an enterprise customer. So it's really important for us to think about, well, if people want to test new things, maybe they're going to test it through their current enterprise setup, which in many cases happens to be Microsoft, with OpenAI's large language models, or maybe other things as well. But Microsoft has a huge installed base of enterprise partners, enterprise customers, and enterprise know-how. And on the security side as well, it's very important. And when we were talking about technology overall, that is going to be also something that's part and parcel to think about moving forward on the AI, is what's the cybersecurity. We talked about CrowdStrike before as one of the companies that we own in the portfolio, very important. But there are others like Palo Alto. These are all important things. Microsoft certainly in the CrowdStrike setup, that was a bit of a faux pas, but quick recovery, and CrowdStrike seems to be hanging in there. Shows sort of the demand for their product, shows the relationship with Microsoft, and it doesn't look like any of that's going to be upset. So next market news here, let's talk about Tesla. That maybe it's the favorite company that everybody doesn't want to like right now. Now, the year-to-date number, now yesterday was up big, 10% plus on the day, but it's down 30% year-to-date. This is through March 25th again here. So down big. There's a lot of concern in the market. Musk is running Doge. There's a lot of people unhappy with what's going on there. And you have people torching dealerships and cars and keying cars. And so this is not a good look. Sales are down in Europe. So, there's a lot of questions around this. But when you think about market leaders in the world of technology, you think about the full self-driving, and you think about Optimus, and you also think about power. And we talked about this when we covered Tesla. These are the things you have to think about. So there's a lot of negative sentiment in Tesla, and certainly sales are down. And if you look at what's happening on the PE side, you still have a pretty high PE when you're talking 100 times on the forward PE. So you talk about the business management, the price valuation, and the balance sheet. On the valuation, certainly not an undervalued company. People projecting lots of growth here. And if you look at what's happening on the full self-driving, what's out now, 13.8.2, very important. And this has been going, very rapidly. It's been, growing as far as the capability of this. And it looks like they're going to be the first company at scale to have a full self-driving. Maybe, you got to get to regulatory approval. That's a separate thing. But they can operate on any road. They have, 7 million plus cars. They'll have 10 million at the end of this year, for example, or close to that number. That's the installed base for the cars driving around. Not all of them are running full self-driving, but certainly have a bunch that are running full self-driving. So that's way bigger than Waymo, for example, that maybe is running a small portion of cars, but not anything close to that. So when you talk about, okay, well, what's the market news for autonomous driving? What's the driving force, pun intended here? Right now, it seems to be Tesla. They seem to be in the pole position. They seem to be on that leaderboard as number one, and everybody else is second. The number of cars. The other part, and we had Dan Ives on talking about this, is the manufacturing base for Tesla. These other companies do not manufacture their own cars. They don't have the setup. They're using a different technology, which, Tesla has called a fool's errand before, and maybe it is and maybe it isn't with the LiDAR, but certainly they do not own the manufacturing and they capabilities, and they don't have those chops to get those cars out in any meaningful numbers going from here. Now, maybe that changes. They have some partnerships. All that can change. However, right now, who leads on the, vision-based, go anywhere in the US and now in China? So if you go online, you can find videos of people using full self-driving both in the US and China. We're mentioning both countries heavily here today in the market news, but Tesla is leading, I would say, in both those categories. And if you go online, you go on X, you can find videos of people using full self-driving in China on a variety of different roads and saying how that they're getting fairly good results with limited interventions in that. And the other part of this is the Optimus. Now, if everybody wants to get a robot that make their bed, wash their dishes, cleans their house, this is going to be significant, right? And if they can get the production, this goes back to the manufacturing base here. Tesla can produce these robots at scale. I think few other companies would have that manufacturing capability, the hardware, the software, the autonomous piece, all camera driven. That's going to be put into the autonomous humanoid robot. Right now, the Optimus platform is that platform moving forward. So this is going to be an interesting setup. The market value alone for that could be in the several $1 trillion. If everybody wants to have a robot, this could be the biggest product ever. Now, that's a lot of speculation, but they are making progress on that. They say they're going to get some robots out this year. We'll see how that goes. But it is interesting. I think you should be following. Again, this is market news. That's why we're talking about it. I think you should absolutely be following what's happening on the autonomous driving, the full self-driving, and on the Optimus platform. The other piece that I'll mention, you should definitely be paying attention to what's happening in the energy business. A lot is moving to solar. And if you look at what's happening in China, adding a lot of solar, what you need for that is batteries. Tesla is a leader in that. They're selling as many megapacks as they can right now. And with their integrated software, thermal management systems, they are a leader in that category. And they can probably sell as many as they can produce at the moment. So that is a growing business. And as the world becomes more and more electrified, that's going to be more and more important. You need to add solar. You need to add batteries to back that up. The sun doesn't shine at night, depending on where you are in the world. And so super important. It also harmonizes the grid because electricity has to continue to flow for the grid to stay stable. So there are many important reasons to do that. They build this software called AutoBidder. I encourage you, we talked about that before, to pay attention to that also. So that's what's happening in the market. So we covered a few different companies. We covered the Global Development Forum, which is happening in China. Again, headliner company in the US, Apple there, Tim Cook in country. I do think it's worth time to think about what's happening between the two countries. Tariffs remain at the top of the news. We'll see what's going to happen here in early April 2nd. But you got a lift in the market over the last couple of days because Trump has at least indicated maybe it's not going to be as bad as everybody thinks, and the market seems to be interpreting that as good news. Time will tell, but something for us to think about. Overall, again, for the GW Investment Institute and the funds that we run, we're certainly not trying to be day traders, but we encourage all of our students, and if you're at home and you're an analyst and you're an investor and you're a business person, you should be paying close attention to what's happening in the markets every day to try to build your own base of knowledge. So the big companies are obviously the ones to follow. Some of the smaller companies, it's interesting. Leading edge technologies is what's happening. Looking across sectors, I would say stay focused, for example, on the things that you like, you're interested in. You can do a lot more work on those things. In our case, for the Investment Institute, we're heavy in technology. Our students have spent a lot of time on that. Seems to be the way of the world in any case. It seems like most companies at this point are technology companies in different sectors because they have to use technology, whether that's in the consumer, that's in healthcare, that's in finance. As an example, the way of forward, and has been in the past, is the use of technology. And certainly right at the top of that list is artificial intelligence, AI, which we've been talking about today. And all the companies that we've talked about today have their play in their space in that AI. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to what's happening in the US. Pay attention to what's happening with tariffs. Pay attention to what's happening in China, the number one and the number two economies, respectively, by GDP. We will talk more about my trip in China and some of my takeaways. We'll have a separate episode for that. Thanks for watching this episode. Today was Market News with Rodney Lake, and we'll see you back on the next episode. Thank you. Disclaimer, the content shared in the GW Investment Institute podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of the GW Investment Institute or the George Washington University. Listeners should not act upon the information provided without seeking professional advice from a qualified financial advisor. Investing involves risks, including the loss of principal. The GW Investment Institute, the George Washington University, and the podcast hosts do not assume any responsibility for any investment decisions made based on the content of this podcast. Always conduct your own research and consult with a financial advisor before making any investment decisions.